Hola, kia rana, talofa, kia ora. Greetings, everybody. Greetings, thrice greetings. It's wonderful you could be with us today. We've got a great group of presenters and panelists to answer some critical questions around the reopening and recovery of tourism in the South Pacific. My name's Chris Adams. I look after research and insights at Miles Partnership, and I'm delighted to be joined and partner in this webinar with Matthew Finlay from Airlon Pacific. And I'm going to pass over to Matthew in a moment to do all the introductions of the other panelists. But we're also delighted, of course, to work with SPTO, South Pacific Tourism Organization, on this webinar and be invited to connect and join with you today. Hopefully, we're going to share some practical insights on what is an incredibly complex, challenging, but fast-moving crisis. What we've attempted to do today is gather the latest research, analysis, and global examples from around the world, because everybody's in this together, to help provide some insights and guidance to thinking about your own reopening and recovery. So whether you're a destination, a tourism business in the South Pacific, you're a airline or agency in Australia, New Zealand, and I see we've got some people joining us from as far afield as Europe. Hopefully there'll be something to share with you today. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Matthew to do the rest of the introductions.
Thanks, Chris. Look, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Our speakers today include Halatau Fua. Halatau has been with the Cook Islands Tourism Corporation for 10 years and CEO for the past 8, with visitor volumes growing 42% over the period, on an annual rate of about 5.3% per annum. He has vast experience in the Pacific, including various roles with the ANZ Bank in Kiribati and also Tonga, and holds a Master's in Business Administration. Halatau is currently interim chair of the South Pacific Tourism Organisation since being overwhelmingly endorsed and elected to the role in May 2020. So welcome, Halatau. Also with us is James Goodwin. James is the Chief Executive of the Australian Airports Association, an organisation representing the interests of more than 300 airports at aerodromes across Australia. James started in May this year, quickly adapting to the challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic has been having on the sector, sort of a baptism of fire, if you will. He has led the public policy, advocacy and stakeholder engagement strategies in this dynamic environment, and that is for sure. Before the Airports Association, for a number of years, James was the Chief Executive of the leading vehicle safety advocate in Australia and New Zealand, the Australasian New Car Assessment Program. James has held senior corporate affairs and government relations positions in a number of organisations, including Air Services Australia, and is a former journalist and news presenter and current board member of St John's Ambulance. Welcome to you, James. Also joining us is Jessie McComb. Jessie is a destination development and tourism expert currently working for the International Finance Corporation at the World Bank Group. She is a core team member of the World Bank's Global Tourism Team. Jessie has 20 years of experience working with governments, businesses and communities to leverage tourism for economic development. She is passionate about improved destination management and marketing through evidence-based decision-making and working with government to increase knowledge of tourism development. Her work at IFC also includes spreading the benefit of tourism through increased local sourcing by hotels and high-value tourism development. Jessie holds the Masters of Tourism Administration from George Washington University with a concentration in sustainable destination management, and a BA Honours from Hamilton College. Originally from the US, she is now based in Suva, as she was showing off to us earlier about the lovely weather she's having there. So welcome to our 3 panelists that will be speaking later. As Chris mentioned, my name is Matthew Finlay. I lead Airlon Pacific's global business development function and was most recently retained by NT Airports, which includes Darwin and Alice Springs, having previously worked at airports including Newcastle in Australia, Christchurch in New Zealand, also Auckland in New Zealand, and 7 others in Europe and North America. My past commercial focus has been in the areas of airport property development, retail, corporate affairs, aeronautical pricing, and especially for the last 12 years, air service development, or ASD. My most notable achievements has been the establishment of several Asian carriers into new and emerging destination markets, such as securing the first Chinese services into Auckland, then Christchurch, and subsequently Darwin. And that's the introduction really for the 4 of us so far. Chris, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and as I mentioned, my name is Chris Adams. I look after research and insights and also our South Pacific division at Miles Partnership. We're a global marketing agency. We've been around 68 years, but frankly never dealt with a challenge quite like this before. We work with over 150 destinations plus dozens of airlines and hotels. And I've spent a quarter of a century working in tourism in the South Pacific, North America, and Europe. So we've got a lot of content to cover today. I'm going to kick it off with the latest South Pacific research that we've been fortunate enough to create in conjunction with a partner, Forward HQ in New Zealand. I'm going to there share some international examples. Matthew's going to have a look at the Pacific aviation market and what are some of the drivers that are going to really shape the recovery. Halatoa is going to give us what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating update on the planning for the New Zealand Cook Islands travel reopening. James will give us a perspective from in Australia and some of the challenges, but hopefully opportunities that they're dealing with. And then finally, Jesse's going to share some resources from the World Bank. And of course, they're working all over the world with developing countries, island destinations on reopening and recovery. All of the slides and the research and a range of the other resources are all available right now up on a website. So you can visit there, milespartnership.co.nz SPTO/resources, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We've been running for the last 6 months since the start of the crisis, global webinars all over the world, bringing speakers together, and all of those webinars, plus a whole range of others and research from over 9 research and data providers, plus case study examples from around the world, are all available on our COVID-19 portal, Clarity in a Time of Crisis. So let's kick it off with a look at what New Zealanders are thinking about travel to the South Pacific in this time of crisis. And Forward HQ, a New Zealand consulting agency, they've in fact worked with SPTO on a reopening strategy. They also conduct research, and on July 29th surveyed 300 New Zealanders about their intentions and outlook and interest in travelling to the Pacific. You can see just under a quarter have got active plans in the next 6 months, despite all the challenges of border closures, etc. Not surprisingly, Cook Islands is top of the list there. Traditionally, a destination like Fiji would be number 1, but of course, Cook Islands, and we'll be hearing from Halatoa about the hopefully soon reopening of travel is number 1. But you can see there's pretty strong interest across all of the South Pacific destinations. And then we specifically asked, how safe is travel to the Cook Islands? And what do New Zealand travellers think specifically about this? And so the question was, travel to the Cook Islands is being planned actively. Hopefully it'll happen the next 2 to 3 months. How safe would you consider a trip to be to the Cook Islands? And it really highlighted something we've seen all over the world, even in a destination as safe as the Cook Islands or as New Zealand. Of course, New Zealand now has, I think, 90 days plus and no community transmission. The Cook Islands, I don't think, has had a single COVID-19 case, but you can still see there's significant uncertainty. And so this issue of reassuring and building confidence around travel and safety and what are the health protocols to assure people's safety is absolutely fundamental, well in advance of any other sort of tourism marketing message. Communication needs to start with health messaging. We did ask people about what information they're looking for. They are interested in deals and offers, but frankly, that information about health and safety status and news is even more fundamental in terms of assuring people and then getting on to the other more practical issues about how to travel, when to travel, and what to do, etc. Again, that research will be shared up on the website, and I'll come back to that in a moment. moment. If we look around the world, and we work with over 150 destinations, plus we've surveyed dozens more, we really see sort of three broad types of reopening strategies. The Cook Islands and New Zealand are really in a unique position of trying to develop a travel bubble between two safe nations. And of course, there was discussion about Australia and New Zealand having a travel bubble. This is based, of course, on zero community transmission and, you know, building the reopening around that sort of managing the health crisis down to what is an incredibly safe position. Most countries in the world are not in that position and realistically will not be until there's some sort of vaccine or breakthrough in terms of therapeutics. But we do see countries like Tahiti, and they're probably the most robust example of a multi-tiered testing regime. So they now are insisting, as a number of destinations are, about a test 3 days prior to arrival. They're actually working with a private company called COVID Consultants, so that out of North America, for example, you can't rely on public testing coming back within 3 days. You can pay, I believe it's just over $200, and you'll get your COVID-19 test back guaranteed within 48 hours. And they've actually got a 4-day, after arrival, 4-day self-administered test that they're also applying. They've been in the news just recently in terms of a incident or a case on a cruise ship. But they'll be worth monitoring in terms of how they go, as do other destinations that have on-arrival testing. Iceland reopened their borders at the start of July. They've got now, I think, a month into it, and have been traditionally welcoming around 500 visitors on a daily basis. You pay €120 for an on-arrival test. Austria's got a similar model in place, as do others. And a number of island destinations, including Bermuda, the Virgin Islands, and others, have got the 72-hour strategy, but prior to arrival, but have struck issues around getting travellers getting access to that test. So this health and hygiene is absolutely fundamental. If we have a look around the world at the best available research and how travellers are reacting, we've got to deal with these concerns about health and safety. So that starts, of course, with a national strategy about reopening, and we want to really reinforce the message that whatever advice we offer today, or resources or examples, it needs to be driven obviously fundamentally by each island nation, what's appropriate, what's safe, and what level of risk, because there's essentially risk in any strategies, including arguably having no travel, what's appropriate to your destination, your people. But we do see examples around the world of health and cleaning strategies, both from private sector companies, and that can include everything from regular cleaning through to offering a group of staff who stay with the same group of visitors throughout their visit. There's a range of resources available that have been developed. Probably the most comprehensive is the World Travel and Tourism Council. I've got the web address right there, and they've got protocols not only overall for nations, but for each industry sector, including accommodation, airports, attractions, etc. So some great resources that you can really access. High-end travellers. So we're seeing a lot of island destinations really sort of help kickstart their recovery by focusing on high-end travellers. In the United States, under the CARES Act from Congress, there was help for the aviation market. That also substantially reduced fees and taxes on private jets. That has helped spur a strong response in terms of high-end. I'm talking about very high net worth individuals who have access to private jets, either their own or can rent one, in terms of putting together groups of travellers to head to destinations in the Seychelles, Bahamas, even Tahiti. In fact, I heard a story last weekend that one particular broker of private jets had 6 separate parties organising private jets for flights down to Tahiti just this last weekend. And of course, they come down often staying for a long time, and they're looking for comprehensive support. So these are called sort of travel bubbles, and there's a variety of high-end travel agencies around the world. Based on True Story is one of them, a UK-based agency. I think they've also got an operation in the United States that organises everything from start to end. So they'll organise the jet, they'll organise the testing, both before departure and of course, in Tahiti's case, on arrival. They organise the resorts, including, for example, if you want the same group of staff all the way through. And there's a number of resorts as well as island destinations working with these agencies that are packaging this up. So of course, this isn't the mainstream market, but this is a market that's already traveling and you know, can be lucrative. Other island destinations are exploring other opportunities. Barbados pivoted actually from reopening to the mass market to more selective, both high-end travelers, but also offering the opportunity for people to work and stay for extended periods of time. So they've now got a work visa available where travelers can come and actually work and live in Barbados for up to 12 months. And of course, many companies now no longer require you to be in the office. You can work from essentially anywhere. Internet connectivity speed is obviously an issue here, but increasingly workers are being flexible and adaptable. We're also seeing all sorts of innovation in terms of digital storytelling, digital marketing, and this is a fundamental capability both during the crisis and coming out of the crisis. So communicating, as you can see up here on the Puerto Rico site, clear messaging around the reopening, health and safety protocols, border requirements, testing requirements, etc., fundamental. But digital storytelling to engage with consumers well in advance of any visit. And so Puerto Rico is one of our clients, and they've been running very successful consumer webinars where they have notable chefs, musicians, celebrities connect with the audience and share whether it's cooking experiences, menus that you can do at home, drinks, storytelling, etc. And so there's obviously an opportunity to connect with visitors and of course your expat populations, etc., who then in turn can be storytellers. You also want to have a look at your digital content to make sure that it's comprehensive and up to date. So that's on your own websites, but also on critical platforms such as Google and Facebook. So do they have opening hours up to date? Is their opening status correct? Do they even know how to access, for example, their Google My Business listing? Just a quick look across the Pacific shows that there's lots of businesses that do not have complete or accurate information. So we've actually put together a quick 3-step tip sheet here on 3 essential things that every business can and should do to check that their information is accurate and up to date, their opening hours are up to date, and that they're correctly described on Google. And obviously South Pacific, Facebook is also important. We've also gathered together 11 essential and free online marketing tools. All of those are available up on that webinar site that I mentioned. You can see the address right there. So let me pass over to Matthew in a moment, but just in terms of summarizing what we've seen, it's critically important to have a look around the world and learn from other experiences, what's happening with these reopening strategies, what's working, what isn't working, health and safety critical. I wanted to also stress that recovery starts at home. It isn't going to replace international visitors, but you need to obviously look to activate your local market and even regional travel within the South Pacific while borders for longer haul travelers reopen. High-end travelers often immediate opportunity and focus on that digital marketing capacity building. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Matthew.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it. So just over the next 7 to 8 slides, there's about 7 slides of content. I wanted to give the audience a thought around or some thinking around what the size of the Pacific travel market could be for bubbles that do emerge, for instance, from New Zealand and Australia in particular. So Chris, just onto the next slide there, just to give a bit more depth into who we are as a company. We have 12 staff in 7 offices, one of the largest independent air service development consultancies with about 40 clients at any one particular time. And we've completed about 250 projects worldwide over the 10+ years we've been operating. Into the next slide there, Chris. This here is a snapshot of what the Australian and New Zealand combined market to the Pacific looks like in 2019. And you can see there Fiji has been incredibly popular, but second is Hawaii, and then later down further towards the end there's French Polynesia, with about in all up about 25,000 travellers per week travelling to the Pacific. And when you sum that up together, it's about 1.3 million travellers from Australia and New Zealand travelling to the Pacific over a very large number of different destinations, of course. And if you go into the next slide there, the growth in that market has been quite impressive. Many countries have had very good growth over the last 5 years, and this is ranked in descending order of that growth over the last 5 years. So well done to Halatoa. You're leading the pack there at Cook Islands at 9%. And that's a good outcome, of course. Western Samoa, 8%. That's driven mainly actually by Australians travelling to Western Samoa. And you can see there, Hawaii has fallen off somewhat in popularity more recently. US dollar changing in that period of time, of course, has had a significant impact. But what is interesting is that Australians in particular, and New Zealanders to a lesser extent, are beginning to travel closer to home. In fact, the long haul travel that Australians used to undertake in the middle of the last decade is not occurring as much as it is now. Now, you would recall I just mentioned 1.3 million travellers to the Pacific over the last year in 2019. Well, that's roughly equivalent to the same volume of travellers from Australia that went to Bali in just 1 year. One destination, roughly speaking, even more recently exceeding 25,000 travellers in a week. So this begins to make you think about where possibly once bubbles do or are created and you're ready to accept new travellers and visitor markets, where people might switch their travel behaviour to enable them to enjoy a bit of a warmer climate, if you will. We were talking very earlier on about the weather in Suva today. I can tell you I haven't left New South Wales in the last 4 months, which is most unusual. I haven't done this less travelling for over 2 decades. And so to get to Suva for me would be a dream come true. But what is giving us confidence and what we're telling our clients is that the New Zealand experience, insofar as their ability to open up domestically for travel, has been quite impressive. But what is very evident is that these numbers change week by week. If you talk to the airlines today about their planning horizons, most of them would have said 2 years ago they're planning 3-5 years in advance, and that's why they're ordering aircraft with that time frame. Now talking about planning their networks and adding new services on a week-by-week basis because things are changing dramatically. So this forecast was prepared on Wednesday, Thursday last week, and of course on Sunday, Victoria moved to a stage 4 lockdown. So the Australian curve here, as far as the 12-month rolling projection, so far as seat capacity, which of course allows travel to occur, will push out even further. But what is pleasing is that the New Zealand domestic experience is showing that there is a latent demand, especially for leisure travel. So a lot of our Pacific neighbours, of course, are in the a good place of having, the leisure experience available once it is available to actually enjoy. Corporate travel will come back much later. So that's a very encouraging aspect. But looking out into as far as, how you talk to airlines about encouraging them to add new services to take up this pent-up demand, usually takes about a 3-year process. Now you're compressing this now down to a very small period of time, maybe weeks or months, and indeed in Australia's experience more recently, as far as Queensland, they've had new city pairs established, which has not normally been available, for instance, from the Sunshine Coast to Cairns. New carriers have been enticed onto these new sectors because destinations, airports and airlines have come together and talked about new opportunities that are emerging because they can't travel outside their state. And so I think that's something to be very mindful of. And if you go into the next slide there, Chris, There's different mechanisms and ways in which airlines think about new services they should connect new destinations. Air New Zealand at the bottom right there has a wheel, if you like, a wheel of fortune, you might like to call it, insofar as how they choose their networks, and ensuring that your destination and your city and your place that you want to promote to this new audience certainly needs to fall within one of these characteristics to ensure that you can secure service from them. What is really interesting is that, and certainly I've left this slide and deliberately choosing Canada 3000, is that it's all very well talking about our own domestic markets, but of course the reason why we look to other markets offshore is to find ways to smooth out our seasonality, or our periods where our own domestic markets are back at work, or they don't have school holidays available throughout the entire year. So where are these new markets coming from? And of course, in the Cook Islands experience, back in the early part of the century, Canada 3000 was a fantastic airline coming through Hawaii down to the Cooks, and then on to Auckland and indeed Sydney. Now that airline, of course, was born out of the fact that in the Northern Hemisphere, Canadians wanted to escape the winter, and of course the Cook Islands offered a fantastic opportunity for that. And so eventually in time, once these bubbles are formed, or air corridors are formed, I think it's important to also think about where these next opportunities are coming from, and just be mindful of the opportunities that these could present down the track. Chris, that's me for the moment. I think it would be useful to pass it on to our guest panelists to now have the next speaker.
Very good. Kia ora, Alatoa. Over to you to give us an update on the reopening plans for New Zealand Cook Islands.
Good on, Chris, and thank you for the opportunity to talk today. Before we go on to the actual border opening, I just want to take you back to the strategy or the plan that we put in place back in March, that's shown in the next slide. So back in March, we realized that as part of this whole pandemic was going to be a long-term sort of situation for us. So there was a need for us to relook at where we're going as a destination, as well as a national tourism authority. And so we looked at staggering the plans that we had, and we all have different names on how we call these staggering sort of system. But it was important for us to try and stagger and put in stages, given the uncertainty that has dawned ahead of us, that we have to plan and make sure that we plan against the changes that's being put upon us. So the first stage for us was to really reset the whole destination as a whole, and focus on where we need to start bringing the destination back into where it should be. And I think this is where we deep dived into the whole work with our government partners, because that's where we needed to put our efforts in, as well as repurposing the team here, which I'll talk about shortly. We also need to look at the refresh, which is, for this period of time, is looking how do we look at the new norm? How do we incorporate the changes that's necessary for the industry to look at border opening? And this is where the discussions with New Zealand is very important for us, as our major market and the key market that we'll only plan to open in the very near future. Then in the reopening stage, post-July 2021, is where we plan at this stage, which is still uncertain, but likely that we would look at other markets, depending on how the pandemic unfolds in the next 12 months. So in the next slide, we look at how we had to repurpose the corporation. So when we hit April, there was no more work for us from a destination marketing point of view. We put a pause on all the marketing work that we did internationally. Fortunately, we invested in digital marketing 5 years ago, where we have developed skills for the staff here, especially around digital marketing, graphic design. And so immediately there was an opportunity for us to repurpose the team that we provide communication services to our government departments. As you all know, a lot of our government departments, whether you're in health or infrastructure, communication is not necessarily your strength. And so there was a natural sort of cohesion and integration that was necessary for us. So we developed a lot of the materials that was required for the Ministry of Health regarding good hygiene, disinfection processes, and social and physical distancing. We also developed a new website because the Ministry of Health website was not compatible with the social mediums, and so we needed to develop a new website. And it was a whole of government approach. We also implemented a new legislation for COVID-19 to allow certain border and social distancing measures to be put in place. So I think it was really good for us from a government point of view to look at how we can add value to trying to develop a strong foundation that'll become a necessary for us at such time that we open borders. So just back into the last slide. We also we're quite fortunate that the Ministry of Finance provided an economic response plan, and in this plan there was a stimulus for the private sector on wage subsidies as well as business support, financial support. And now in the stage 3 of the economic response plan, there's work more into credit facilities and all sorts of subsidies that we can provide to hibernate the private sector during this time. On the next slide, we look at the real core of why I'm here today is to talk about the refreshing period. And we put in there, there's a 12-month time frame there from July 20 to June 2021 because of the level of uncertainty that we're facing at the moment. And we have been very fortunate to have New Zealand control the COVID-19 successfully, where they've eliminated community transmission in over the last 90 days. And through the political arm that we've had the discussions between the two governments, there is now a move to formalize an arrangement to open the border between New Zealand and the Cook Islands. Now, as we know, opening a border seems quite easy because we had quite a vibrant industry before COVID-19 hit us. But as we know, there's a lot of protocols that need to be put in place because it is a high risk entry where the border, we have a lot of risks of having the virus seep through the border. So it was very important for us to focus on 3 key things, and that is the health protocols, border protocols, both aviation and maritime, as well as industry preparedness. The health protocol was probably the main focus domestically, was to ensure that our infrastructure is up to speed and that we can handle any form of spread of the virus here in the Cook Islands. So in the last 3 months, there has been significant investment by government in our health infrastructure. And in that health infrastructure, we managed to complete 2 negative pressurized rooms to allow us to identify cross-contamination with diseases. The PPE gear had to be in place quite quickly during that time. We've invested in our testing capabilities and our surveillance, as well as dedicating a ward in the event that we were to have an outbreak here in the Cook Islands. So all the infrastructure with the assistance of New Zealand has been very effective for us to ensure that, that we have a health system prepared. We've also established various groups within the community. So we had about 10 different community groups stationed around the island so that they basically broaden the scope of health through contact tracing, as well as supporting the community in communications, because that was very important for us. So the health protocols, we feel that we are prepared to, and the discussions between our health ministry and New Zealand has been quite extensive to ensure that New Zealand is comfortable with the level of preparedness that we have from a health perspective. The border protocols was also important for us because we had to make sure that the border is where a lot of the risk lies in terms of opening borders. So we had to look at the eligibility. And at this stage, we're only looking at New Zealand citizens and New Zealand PR holders. As you all know, Cook Islanders are New Zealand citizens, so it's a natural free movement of people. We also had to look at the time frame that we need people to be in New Zealand, whether it's 14 days or 30 days. And this will eliminate any other Kiwis coming from outside of New Zealand to New Zealand to ensure that they remain in New Zealand, which is community transmission free. The separation of passengers is a major work that the airports are working on at the moment. ensuring that the airport are being reconfigured in terms of its infrastructure to allow separate lanes and separate terminals for quarantine flights and non-quarantine flights. So as we consider the changes now, the Cook Islands will be the first in terms of non-quarantine flights. And from the journey of checking in to coming to the Cook Islands and arriving back into Auckland, it has to be a completely separate process from all the quarantine flights that's happening at the moment. With that separation, there's also work that's required for the crew to ensure that there's separation of crew in different destinations. There's also the need for us to look at aircraft disinfection. As we know, the virus does stay on surfaces, so the disinfection of the aircraft procedures has to be vetted by both the Ministry of Health in New Zealand and here in the Cook Islands. And communication, of course, is very important for us as we ensure that both consumers and the public and the local community here are well abreast of what's happening in terms of these changes. The final part for us is, sorry, just going back to the border protocols, we also have the maritime. So the maritime is, we have a greater risk of maritime because it's open to any vessels or any yachts that will come here to the Cook Islands. So the protocols are being formalized between our officials here in the Cook Islands and New Zealand to ensure that those protocols are met. There could be humanitarian reasons that we have to provide access to those that are through maritime access. And those protocols have to be watertight to ensure that there's no risk of the virus entering the Cook Islands. On the industry preparedness, we have, in the last 3 to 4 months, we've had a lot of work with the Ministry of Health to produce what we call the Cook Islands Promise. So the Cook Islands Promise is a consumer-facing document that we provide that provides some details around good hygiene. It provides details on social distancing that we have to conduct here in the Cook Islands, as well as the disinfection. So we've created this with different zones to allow education to so that we'd be able to educate our tourism ministry of the new norm. Pragmatic physical distancing, avoiding crowded places. We look at the practices that we do at restaurants and cafes, public transportation, as well as the accommodation itself. So it's looking at things like a contactless check-in, luggage, and cleaning of rooms, minimizing that. So all these have been set in terms of a consumer document, which is the Cook Islands Promise. We also have an industry guide that goes out to the industry and themselves to guide them, which is accompanied by a video rapid training that we've introduced to ensure that the industry is abreast of all these protocols. Part of this is our contact tracing. So we've introduced what we call the Cook Safe, which is a QR code system, which complements the manual system that we have at Health. So this provides some sort of contact tracing mechanism that we can use in the event that we have to contact trace any visitor or locals that have been suspected of COVID-19. So until such time that these protocols have been formalized, which is happening very quickly between the two countries, once the cabinet approves, both here in the Cook Islands and New Zealand, then it'll be at the political level to decide on a date of opening, where we have to ensure that all these high-risk areas are being ironed out, cross our T's, dot our I's to ensure that we're all ready for such time we open the borders. Just on the last slide, I've just put in there from July 2021 is that we are also mindful that we had direct access to Los Angeles and Sydney that we have suspended since March. And our other markets are very important for us in terms of outer islands like Aitutaki, where majority of visitors there are from the Northern Hemisphere markets. So we'll be monitoring those markets very closely in how they're managing the COVID-19. And if there's some sort of progress that the government here is comfortable to look at reopening those borders, then we will start looking at the Northern Hemisphere markets in Australia. As part of that is looking at what's the key lesson learned here for the Cook Islands is our diversification. So the Cook Islands is heavily reliant on tourism. So this whole exercise has given us some message and learnings on the importance of diversifying There has been a lot of investment in our infrastructure. We've got the fiber optic cable for high-speed internet that's just been laid. That was launched in June. We also, as a country, graduated to a developed country by the OECD in January this year. So there's a lot of changes that we need to incorporate in how do we diversify the economy, whether it's based in agriculture or other economic sectors that we have to consider to alleviate any sort of magnitude, any sort of disruption of this size happening in the future. I think that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Halatoa. So let's jump across or down or across to Canberra in Australia. And James, CEO of the Australian Airports Association, is going to offer some insights and perspective from Australia.
Thanks for that, Chris, and hello everyone. When I was first invited to give this presentation, it was all, even 2 or 3 weeks ago when I was talking to Matt, it was going to be some positive news. Well, we were hoping we'd have some positive news. So I think what I have to give you is really some frank and honest update from Australia. Australia is doing it tough, and the aviation and the tourism sector is doing it tough. You can see on the screen here, these are the passenger movements over the financial year. We see March, April, May, passenger movements, the international down 98%. I had someone say to me the other day, I'm surprised there was even 2% of travel, and really what that is repatriation flights or some freight operations and things. So what we started to see though was a glimmer of hope in June that domestic travel in particular started to increase slightly. I think as some people think of Australia as one country, but what the pandemic has shown is really we are 8 different states or colonies as they were established, and it's clear that something like a pandemic has meant that those restrictions between those states were reintroduced. One positive though is that, and just picking up on what Halatoa was saying, is that the crisis has highlighted to governments and to the communities the importance of aviation and tourism, to the economics of countries, of nations, to jobs. Really, if you'd asked a politician 12 months ago how important is tourism to the economy, they probably wouldn't have thought it was as important as what they now know it is. So that's one positive, that we are a strong focus, and to try and re-engage and get tourism and aviation back to a normal that we can. Look, when I started thinking about this presentation, say 2 weeks ago, really Australia was managing the pandemic quite well. The international borders are closed and remain closed, and there is no formal timeline to reopen those borders. There were a number of repatriation flights that people were required to do mandatory 14 days hotel quarantine. And the picture on the screen there is actually a border closure between Queensland and New South Wales. So this is what I mean, that there is actually, the country has been closed and travel for Australians within Australia has been restricted as a way of trying to get across the pandemic. A few weeks ago, we were still talking about a trans-Tasman bubble. We were talking about bubbles with Pacific Island nations, and we were talking about even potentially having bubbles with Japan or Singapore. What has changed, and if we go to the next slide, what has changed is we've now had community transmission outbreaks, and the hotel quarantine mechanisms, certainly in Victoria, has not worked well. And we've had mass outbreaks of community transmissions, which has changed the mood and has changed the government thinking on this. State borders started closing again. Victoria is really the state that has had the most number of active cases. And what this has really done is change the confidence level for a government, the Australian government, but also other governments in New Zealand, in the islands, about discussing reopening borders. The picture on the screen are people required to go into hotel quarantine, and we can see the army and police forcing them into that. That was how we were managing it. But as we can see now on the screen, these are the number of cases in hospital. So there's, and this has probably changed overnight, but there's about 400 to 500 people in hospital. But what you can see here, I mentioned that Australia is really 8 different states. And we can see the 8 on the screen, the ACT, New South Wales, Northern Territory. Victoria is the problem. And what we could argue is whether we could have reopening some borders and some travel bubbles between the states that are not affected. If we isolate Victoria, Australia is still doing quite well. The number of active cases in Australia is about 6,000 or 7,000 cases, but I thought the showing the number of people in hospital provides a bit more of an idea of how we're coping with this. So still quite low numbers on an international scale, but you can also see it was really in Victoria. So the reality check, and that's what I'm really here to give, is the reality check. It's not particularly great news, but the reality check is certainly we were having those discussions. 2 months ago, we were having discussions that we would have a trans-Tasman bubble by September. That's not going to happen. And in fact, that may not happen until next year, is what the indications might be. So there is really no appetite from the government at the moment until those community transmissions come in to check. I've raised the point about, well, could we have a state-by-state bubble? Could we have Cook Islands to New South Wales to Sydney, for instance? The difficulty with that, and I don't think that's off the table, but the difficulty with it is the laws and the regulations that deal with the borders and quarantine and air travel are really national pieces of legislation. We then get into those situations, well, who is responsible and how could you stop those people then going to another perhaps hotspot, as we're referring to them in Victoria. So at the moment, we really need to get on top of those community transmissions in Victoria before we can confidently have these discussions again. However, the glimmer of hope is what I'm describing as, rather than the tourist bubbles, but the economic bubbles. As a trial, the government is considering things like allowing international university students back in. The university sector has been hit particularly hard. So allowing students in from New Zealand, from China, from India who attend university in Australia, they are more traceable. They're going to be here much longer than a holiday maker. They would still be required at the moment to have 14 days in quarantine, but that is something that is a positive step to at least look at those systems in place and have that as a trial to start relaxing some of the hard border closures. The other one is seasonal workers coming in from particularly the Pacific Island nations. It's quite clear that even with higher unemployment in Australia, that many people either won't be able to go and do those jobs, particularly in the Northern Territory or Queensland. So picking fruit, picking mangoes and so on, where the workforce is usually seasonal workforce coming in from the islands, that is still being talked about, that they would still have to quarantine in hotels and make sure they're safe. But that is another way of opening the door. And really that's what we're trying to do, to open the door to see if those policies and procedures work. So picking up with what Halatoa was saying is we need to be ready. And on the screen is really the domestic COVID safe air travel point. And I've just put a link in the comments of if you've not thought about what you need to do in your country, then you need to start thinking about. We need to be ready. One thing that will provide confidence to governments is that the airport is ready, the airline is ready, and that you've got the systems in place for the cleaning, the screening, the segregation of passengers in a terminal. At the moment, that's quite easy to manage because the numbers are very low. But once we start having more passengers going through a terminal, how are we going to segregate and operate the terminal? Are they physically separated? Are there separate shops? Are there separate bathrooms? Those are the sorts of things that we're going to have to really plan for to provide that confidence to government. So that's what we're looking at today. So, and I just saw that Matthew has confirmed that, yes, confirmed that some seasonal workers allowed in, and that's that glimmer of hope. They're treating it as a trial to see how this will open, but we can see how quickly things are changing at the moment. So my advice is to be ready and be prepared that if the borders are able to be reopened between certain countries, then make sure you're ready with the confidence to say we can do this. But lots of opportunities, and I agree that long haul flights at the moment are really are almost dead with the confidence level of the community. So some of those short hops to places close to Australia, New Zealand, very beneficial. People want to get away on a holiday. People want to have that break. So let's look at the opportunities, new air routes, new airlines, new airports. That's happening domestically in Australia, and I think we should extend that to regions just outside of Australia. So I think lots of opportunities, but unfortunately I don't have a whole lot of good news to share with the community today.
Thank you, James. And hopefully, yeah, the news will turn around with the level 4 lockdown in Melbourne. So our thoughts with everybody in Victoria, obviously. So, and then just finally, and a quick note, we are going to go over the top of the hour. So hopefully you can stay with us. We'll try and take a couple of questions, but just finally, I'll invite Jessie McComb from the World Bank Group to share some of their insights and resources.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to Matthew for the introduction and to the previous panelists. Their opening remarks were really interesting and I think indicate how complex the situation really is for countries that are looking to reopen. Many of you that are signed into the webinar today know me. I have a couple of different roles within IFC and the World Bank. Today I'm wearing my global hat, but I will touch a little bit on some of the things that we're doing at the regional and local level as well. This morning, I'll talk about some of the World Bank resources and policy recommendations for countries looking to reopen their borders. So at a quick global snapshot, we can see that most countries continue to have strict border controls in place, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. And in the Pacific, most destinations and source markets still have travel restrictions in place. But I think as everyone said, and particularly as James pointed out, this is changing on a daily basis. You know, we look at data one day and then overnight something changes and it's a different situation in the morning. You can go ahead to the next slide. Oh, just back one, please. Thanks. At the broader Asia regional level, we are beginning to see some air travel rebound slowly. Asia was obviously on the leading edge of the pandemic and will likely be the first to recover. And I wanted to point out these two graphs here because the World Bank's Global Tourism team has developed a couple of tools. So the first is the Aviation Tracker tool to be able to see changes in air passenger capacity at a global level in a real-time basis. And then the second is a policy tracker tool. And what we see with the policy tracker tool are what are the different types of policy measures that governments around the world are putting in place. And this is just a very small little snapshot since I didn't want to go into detail, but clearly what we see is that there's a focus on the tourism sector. You know, again, as James said, that there's a clear realization that tourism is an incredibly important economic sector, and so governments are responding in kind. And these are just, you know, two examples examples of resources that the bank has on hand at the global level. At the moment, we have been really focusing on supply side changes to the sector in terms of our knowledge products and our data analysis. And what's happening next is we're starting to explore other initiatives. Actually, just go back, please. Thanks. Thanks. We're starting to explore other initiatives that specifically focus on understanding the demand side of the equation. So we'll actually have our guidance, global guidance note coming out soon, and there's a link on the very last slide to the website where that will be published. And then in the future, we will be doing some demand side analysis on consumer sentiments through surveys, as well as surveys with leading travel companies to understand what they need to be able to feel confident to return to a destination. So this is all work going on in the background and will be launching in the coming months. So please look for those. These will be paired with specific research on small island developing states. A new project will be launching soon, which will have research that is very applicable to the Pacific, as well as other SIDS around the world. The goal is for us to leverage this data and research to provide governments with information upon which they can make evidence-based policy decisions. That's really what we aim to do at the global level. Great, next slide. But what our research and engagement with our client countries has shown us is that there are structural changes underway that all destinations must consider. And while there's a tendency to look towards the short-term success in other countries to seek solutions, it's clear that each country really needs to consider its own specific and evolving context in terms of their domestic health sector capacities, their government structures, their government capacities, and particularly the dynamics in their key source markets. Countries look towards the next phase of reopening and determining what policies are needed next, we have identified these 5 key areas that need to be considered. So this, obviously, there's a clear focus on health and hygiene standards, understanding how demand is changing, which is why we're starting to focus particularly in this area to understand what are the trends in these markets, increased consolidation in the sector, and particularly impacts on the workforce, including keeping an eye on things like skills loss and internal migration of tourism workers to other areas of the country. It's going to be difficult to reopen. And then, of course, increasing use of technology and how that's impacting product development and distribution channels within the sector. And then finally, something that the bank and IFC are looking at is the investment area, and particularly how governments can use public investments in destinations to support this Build Back Better scenario. What all these changes mean is that, even with clear plans, destinations are having various success with reopening. I think as Chris mentioned, in Tahiti, really great standard, but even they're starting to see some issues with a cruise passenger becoming infected, right? So, and we've seen this in the Bahamas, we've seen this in some places in Europe, that reopening is complex and multifaceted, and it depends on both the policies and context in the destination as well as their source market countries. And this means that recovery will be sporadic, and we see this happening all over the world. It also means that countries really need to consider what are some of the challenges that existed in the destinations before COVID, right? These things are not going to go away, and particularly in small island developing destinations, there are a lot of contexts that need to be considered in any type of recovery and reopening strategy. Okay. And the World Bank is providing support to our client governments through a range of measures to help them address both these pre-existing conditions and the new sort of reality of COVID-19. And I'm not going to go through these all in detail. We'll be here for the next hour. But in the short term, our focus is really on health responses to adapt and restructure the sector and businesses, financial job saver programs, recovery and crisis management planning. And in the medium term, our support is looking at implementing recovery, planning, building in sustainability. And this is through leveraging practices like the circular economy and also really focusing on helping to boost marketing and promotion budgets. And then, of course, as I noted before, a large focus is on how to leverage investments for recovery. From IFC side, this focuses on the private sector, while the bank provides public sector investment and financing. And we can go to the last slide. And I definitely will not go through all this data. It's just a bit of a snapshot. Closer to home in the Pacific, the World Bank Group has been a leader in analytics and market intelligence for tourism. So some of our previous work on international visitor surveys can provide strong data on the value of different tourism markets and different tourism segments to help the countries identify where recovery efforts could be focused. So for example, this is just something I found quite interesting. When we look at what borders we could reopen and where we should focus our efforts, for a country like Fiji, the intra-Pacific regional travel market is often not considered a priority. But when we look at the data, we see that it's actually the 4th largest market segment for Fiji. And it provides almost $400 million in revenue each year. So yes, it's not as big as Australian or New Zealand tourism in terms of economic impact, but we could look at opening borders in the intra-Pacific regional area, and that could help spark some economic recovery in the short term. And then finally, what's up on the slide is IFC's recently launched Fiji COVID-19 Business Survey. And this is just an example of some of the work that we're doing on ground in the Pacific. We're not, like I said, I'm not going to go through this data in detail, but if people do have questions, I'm happy to talk about the survey. And of course, it's available online in full detail for anyone that would like more information. And just flip to the last slide. Here are some resources. I hope Chris will be circulating the presentations. The top link up there is where our global guidance note can be found once it's published in the coming week or two. And then there's a few other links where you can find other information and resources on the World Bank's tourism-specific response to COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jessie. And just before we come to any questions that Matthew and Jamshir can moderate for us, here's that web address again. So the slide deck's going to be up at the end of this presentation, along with the tip sheets for digital marketing and the research that we quoted before. So, and just a couple of other resources I'll highlight. I briefly mentioned we've gathered case study examples from around the world, including an in-depth look at what Puerto Rico is doing in terms of virtual event and other digital marketing, social media use that Samoa used, particularly during the measles pandemic, and a variety of other dozens of case studies from around the world. And there's also dozens of other webinars. Just this one I wanted to highlight. We had a number of destination leaders from across the United States and Europe talking about the ways in which tourism will be changed forever, including what does this mean for DMOs. So all available. So Matthew, what questions do we have in the final few minutes? And thank you for those people who can stay with us.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, we've got a couple of questions that are coming through the presentations. I'll put a couple out there just for all our speakers to consider and respond as they see fit. So James, Jessie and Halatau, and certainly you, Chris, as well. Here's the first question. Data shows an increasing interest from New Zealanders to travel to the South Pacific in the next 6 months, but the demographic has changed to a much younger audience. 18 to 30-year-olds is now the vast majority of intended travelers, according to our data. Does your data match this, and are you advising the industry to adapt to the needs of a new generation? Perhaps I'll put it to you, to Halatau first to answer, and then perhaps others, James or Jessie, indeed Chris, you can jump in when you're ready. Halatau, you're on mute, by the way. Halatau, you're on mute, my friend.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I think that target market is already captured in the Cook Islands existing marketing strategy, which is basically the millennials. And so the product here in the Cook Islands is tailored for millennials. And how we would reach out in New Zealand is a lot of digital marketing that can reach out to them. We'll also be diversifying our marketing strategy in the next couple of months once we have a border opening date to reach out to all these key target markets. as we understand, a lot of the families, weddings, we do get a lot of weddings which will have all been cancelled, and so that's going to be a gradual build for that market. But I can understand there's going to be a lot of free independent travellers that's going to come through our borders.
And just to clarify, the research that was conducted by Forward, Matthew, did show a slight skew younger. So I'll actually ask Forward, we could perhaps add an additional slide into the presentation just to show the top demographic of the respondents. So, but I think it's likely that given the greater impact of the pandemic on older populations, that people who are, you know, older in age or have underlying health conditions are going to be much more cautious about any sort of travel.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and certainly colleagues in the States have, you know, said to me that they're finding that the research their clients themselves are undertaking individually are showing that those in the older demographics are more concerned about travel. That's for sure. And certainly the next question that was posted earlier, and thanks for those that questions are coming in from Edith and sorry, Christopher as well. Keep those coming in. A question posted earlier was, health protocol will be a key to building confidence both for travellers and locals. It seems like testing prior to departure and arrival will be a key indicator. Are there measures to mitigate the risks of high percentages of false negative results? Over to you, James Halatoa. What do you think?
So false negative, yes. I think testing, I think with air travel, I think the aim is certainly that we're trying to get on top of people or identify people before they fly. So the testing before they're going, before they're leaving, before they even arrive at the airport, they should be able to do and show that they certainly are not, don't have any symptoms. I think at the moment we're sort of referring to really three forms of traveller at the moment. We've got the corporate or the business traveller. The next one is really the visiting family and friends, which is not quite the holiday maker. There are people who are thinking, I haven't seen mum and dad for a while, so I haven't seen that family, or I will go to that friend's wedding, but that's not quite someone taking a holiday. And then we've got the sort of the third element is really the traditional tourist holiday maker. So we're really referring to those three groups in order to restart the travel. And they all have different levels of confidence with what they're trying to do. So I think really the mechanisms need to be, but this is what I mentioned about having the confidence. At least with the air travel, we've got strong mechanisms to be able to track people, to know who it is. It's not like getting a bus or a train. There's a lot of information about people. So I think air travel, we had a survey a few weeks ago that said people were more confident to travel on an aircraft than on a tram or a bus. And I think that highlights that people know that it's a higher value. So they're expecting, there are higher expectations as well. So they're expecting it will be clean, that there will be measures in place, there will be face masks, all of those sorts of things. So I think people will do that. My point though, and it was also to the other question, is we also have to remember, and I hate to be the doom and gloom person on the panel, but there are a lot of unemployed people now in the economy. So Australia had an extra 200,000 people unemployed in June with the economy shutting down. That means there are now almost 1 million people unemployed in Australia, relying solely on welfare benefits. So the economy itself, so the tourists and the demographics that are changing is also an important one to consider, that promoting travel and promoting holidays is fantastic. But we also need to remember that people's income, or people are worried about losing their jobs much more than what they were a few months ago. So that's also another reality check.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. In fact, you know, airlines will talk to you about their different market segments, and even though the volume that's provided by tourism or holiday travel is generally the largest portion that airlines will attract onto their aircraft. It's not normally the most valuable. You know, one of the most valuable segments are, of course, is business or corporate travel. But then, of course, after that is VFR and student travel. You know, there's a very famous comment from a CEO of an airline that once said that, you know, you don't necessarily need to go on holiday because you're worried about your finances, but you do need to go see your mother-in-law once a year. And that VFR traffic is an important element of certainly Pacific Island travel, as well as many other nations around the world. Keep the questions coming in, folks. So there's a couple of more broader questions, and I'll pose one to you, Halatoa, that sort of comes on the back of this sort of conversation, and it was posed directly to you, so it's for you to answer, I think, best. Is the broader Cooks community supportive of border reopening, or do they prefer to stay closed to remove risk of COVID importation?
Thank you, Matthew. I think the community is a very important partner throughout this whole journey. If you would ask me the question 3 or 4 months ago, I would say the community was wanting to close the border. But now there has been a lot of communication, especially from our health department. Our health department plays a key role in reaching out to the community to educate the community on following the epidemiology with New Zealand. The only reason why we would open our borders to New Zealand is on the basis that there is zero community transmission proven in New Zealand in the last 90 days. And we're only entering into this arrangement of a quarantine-free process, given that there is no community transmission proven in both countries. And so we, the Ministry of Health, have now been going out to the media, explaining their position on the border opening, acknowledging that we have reached the cross point where the economic impact far outweighs the health risk right now. And if we are not going to open our borders anytime sooner, then there's going to be a major risk to the livelihoods of Cook Islanders within the next 12 months. Fortunately for government workers, they're still getting full pay during this time, whereas the private sector has gone on the wage subsidies. But in 12 months' time, these government workers still be paid? So there's a lot of uncertainty. And the message from health is safe borders, safe travel, safe journey. So it's all about that safety and how we can elevate vigilance and carefully assessing any border reopening that has to be really safe. So I think those messaging is slowly getting into the community. We have outer islands here. There's 15 islands in the Cook Islands, and the outer islands are more skeptical of border opening. And so there's more stringent process put in place for those going to the outer islands, where there's health screening at the airport, just to give that confidence to the community.
And Matthew, if I could just emphasize the importance of this, we do research across North America and also in other destinations, and one of the key things that is evident is the hesitation, concern from residents about reopening. And I think tourism has to be closely engaged and connected with local residents on what's appropriate, help educate them, but obviously be guided by that, because frankly, our long-term social license to operate could be heavily damaged if tourism is seen as moving too quickly or too fast ahead of what is prudent and sound. So it's another good reason to be engaged with your local residents. You want them out and about when it's safe. You want them spending money with local businesses. They can't, of course, travel overseas themselves, those with the means to do so, but you also want to be connected with them and listening to them.
Indeed.
Just to jump in here, Matthew, the community also plays a critical role in containing the virus, right? So it doesn't matter how good your testing is, you know, if there's always a risk. I think there was somebody that mentioned this in the chat, is that this is not a zero risk situation. And so if the virus does get out, if there is an infected tourist that comes in, the community needs to be an active part of containing the virus, right? So we see this a lot, and I don't know those in other Pacific Islands, we are really relaxed here in Fiji. You know, it's been 100+ days since we've had a a community transmission case. Everybody's hugging and kissing. And if we start reopening borders, the community itself, we need to make sure that we're maintaining these stricter standards of social distancing and health and hygiene, because we need to be an active part of the health response. So it's not just about how do you engage with your community to make sure they're feeling comfortable, but also to ensure that they understand what their role is in reopening the borders.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point, actually. Thank you, Jessie. There's a question actually for you, Jessie, in the chat here. Chris, there's a couple of questions also for you, so be ready for that. But the question in the chat for you, Jessie, is from Chris at SPTO. The question is, World Bank's work is currently bilateral at the moment in the Pacific in terms of tourism. How can you work with SPTO to work on regional tourism programs, particularly COVID-19, as a regional organisation mandated by the leaders of the Pacific to address tourism development?
Thanks for that, Chris. So as you rightly state, we generally work on a bilateral basis, particularly when it comes to any type of financing. So the World Bank does have a number of global and regional programs, and that would really be the best way for us to engage more closely with regional organizations like SPTO. So I briefly mentioned that we have an upcoming project, a global project focused on small island developing states. So in the coming months, as we sort of kick off that project, there might be a number of opportunities for us to reach out to think about how we can best address some of your research needs, some of your knowledge management needs, and what type of information would be useful. I also think a lot of the knowledge and analytics and knowledge development and analytics that we do can be quite useful, and we're always looking for ways to partner with great organizations like SPTO. So I think it's a matter of staying in touch and trying to identify where we might be able to partner through these global engagements that we have. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessie. Chris, there's some questions coming in for you, and also another one for James, but we'll just go to you first, Chris, if you like. One of the questions that was in the chat earlier from a good friend of mine, Tony Everett, who's still on the call. Thank you for staying with us, Tony. What's the outlook for outbound travel from the USA? The first question for you, Chris.
And it's the same Tony Everett.
And mention where you're based, of course. I thought Tony might have known, but you better mention where you are.
Yes, no, I've known Tony, kia ora, Tony, for the last 25 plus years. So as you know, the situation in the States is sort of like Victoria, but probably times 5 or 10. Obviously the scale of the country, the fragmentation of states, the lack of leadership from the federal government, they haven't handled it well. And that has meant that, frankly, a lot of Americans travelers cannot travel to, for example, the EU or other countries. So even as borders are being reopened, that doesn't necessarily include the United States. So, you know, obviously there's enormous pent-up demand, which we're tracking in the research we do in the United States as well. But the outlook has to be muted for the foreseeable next few months until there's some sort of step change in terms of a vaccine or breakthrough in therapeutics.
Thanks, Chris. Another question for you, and this follows on from your comment about the private jet travellers, and certainly Jessie and Halatoa, you might have a comment on this one. Chris talked about the opportunity of high worth private jet travellers, but most of the South Pacific isn't geared up for this. How much money would stay in the local economy? Therefore, is it worth investing resources to attract them? I'll let you answer it first because I also have some thoughts on this as well. But Chris, your views.
Yeah, I suppose, you know, a market like Tahiti traditionally has been, you know, a little bit more focused in the high-end market, and some of their resorts are perhaps set up, but there are obviously examples of resorts. So throughout the Pacific, whether it's in Samoa or Fiji or even Tonga, so I'd say it's a matter of the destination working with specific resort operators to ensure that A, it's going to be feasible from a health and safety perspective within all the caveats we talked about. Is it appropriate for the nation, whether it's a private jet or a commercial plane coming in? But if, you know, you've got to work on it with local operators and then those agency partners. What are your thoughts, Matthew?
Yeah, look, it's a segment of the market that you can serve. The one thing about scheduled regular passenger transport services, such as those flown by Air New Zealand or Jetstar, is that you provide a service to a broader range of the overall segment of the market. There's a question also in here about, you know, Australians traveling to Bali, and do you really want that, you know, high volume market? Well, you don't want all of it, of course, and you're not likely to get all of it. But the point is, the Australians go to Bali because it's close, and there's a range of facilities available for tourists from Australia to visit. And I know some very, very wealthy individuals that travel to Bali 2, 3, in fact, sometimes live there for up to 6 months of the year. And that's because they enjoy the warmth of the weather and don't want to stay in Darwin. So, you know, the point is that, you know, private jet travel is a segment of the market, and regular passenger transport services provided by Jetstar, Air New Zealand, Virgin, Fiji Airways, and Air Kalana and the others in the Pacific broaden that reach and provide opportunities for product in all segments in different countries to appeal to a portion of that traveller market that's coming into their destination. But Jessie, Halatoa, I'm interested in your views.
Yeah, so this is actually an area that IFC has looked at in Fiji, as well as some of the other countries where we have projects. And so what we find with the high-end resorts is they actually have quite a bit of local economic contribution. So they tend to have a higher staff to guest ratio. So they're actually employing more local residents as staff than, I mean, granted, it's much different if you're talking about a sort of a 30-room boutique resort versus a 200 or 300-room hotel, but the staff to guest ratio is usually much higher at a high-end resort. We also did a study on local sourcing of fresh agricultural produce, and this was a few years ago. But actually what we found is that the small high-end resorts overwhelmingly purchase more local fresh produce than the large sort of mid-range resorts. So I think it's a little bit of a misconception to think that high-end luxury means that all the money is immediately flowing out. You really need to think about who is the owner of the resort versus the management company, right? Even if it's high-end, it's still quite likely that the owner of the resort is actually a local resident. So they're paying taxes on all of that money. And thinking about what are the types of activities and what are the travel behaviors and patterns of high-end travelers. You know, as Matt said, they actually tend to stay a little bit longer. They're outlaying a lot of money on activities because they have that disposable income, and they're often much more active travelers, right? So whether that means they're going out on dives, they're going on snorkeling trips, they're, you know, engaging in nature-based tourism, cultural tourism, wellness type of things, they're actually spending a lot more money when they're in country. So, you know, I think it's definitely a market that we need to consider. And it's a market that you know, countries like Fiji have been looking to develop over time as well, even before COVID existed. So I think it's a good opportunity to look at how we can grab a little bit more of that high-end market, particularly coming out of Australia and New Zealand for a country like Fiji. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessie. Halatoa, do you want to add anything more? I've got one last question to wrap it up, but Halatoa, I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you, Matthew. I think for the Cook Islands, you know, as we've seen pre-COVID, was the exclusive luxury travel, both private jets and super yachts, has been increasing sort of market for the Cook Island, for the Pacific, and there's been a lot of, especially in Fiji and Tahiti, you'll see a lot of the infrastructure being reconfigured to suit that market. Just in the current scenario we have, given the multiple stops that you have for private jets, for example, our travel advisory naturally eliminates that sort of market for us unless it comes directly from New Zealand. But it's something that we'll explore secondary to any opportunities out of New Zealand. But for any other access from other countries will be captured in our travel requirements that you're not able to be eligible to enter the Cook Islands.
Yeah, look, that's a good sort of element to think about, isn't it? You know, there's all these different sort of competing matrix requirements from every country, and it's, you know, to understand it is you really need to be in the market to grapple with the different sort of niches that are each market has. That's a good point. Thank you. This is our last question, and James, you're the lucky recipient of this one. So a question for you and other panelists, by all means, would be interested in your views. Perhaps on safety and security of airlines and airports, we know that largely due to the fiscal constraints, inspections are behind schedule and maintenance not up to date. This person asking the question was wondering whether the same is happening to pilots, crew and aircraft maintenance, etc. How to ensure both airlines, airports and aviation staff are ready for such a long downtime.
Yeah, it's obviously a risk for the sector, but it's one of the most highly regulated sectors that you can find. I would suggest that probably the big concern for us is a skill shortage. We know that at the moment, when things start getting back to business as usual, we don't want to have to be trying to upskill pilots, ground crew, and so on. I actually would perhaps counter the claim a little bit that it's highly regulated on how you decommission an aircraft and how you recommission an aircraft. And at the moment, the staff that are working are actually quite busy, because they're using the time to do and to catch up on things like maintenance and to invest in the infrastructure upgrades. I know certainly at the airports, almost everyone that is working now that is not on a stand down or a shutdown or has been made redundant is actually quite busy, because what they're doing, when do you do the maintenance on a busy runway? You can't do it when aircraft are flying. So they're actually using the opportunity now to get that infrastructure upgrades done. So we're getting, and certainly the Australian government has provided assistance, because it's providing broader jobs. It's a job creator, and that's a language and a narrative that the government has been using. So resurfacing a runway, putting in new lighting, new terminal upgrades. We've got new security measures coming into place. There were new operating procedures by the safety regulator here in Australia. They were meant to come into force in August. There's been an extension because of the understanding the financial constraints. But certainly the argument that I would put is that actually people who are still working in aviation are actually quite busy at the moment, being able to catch up on those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's certainly been the comment from a number of clients that have taken the opportunity, because there's been such long sort of days and weeks sometimes between flights, that they have been able to do that sort of thing. I think it's absolutely spot on. Is there any other comments from any of the panelists before I pass it back to Chris to wrap up?
I would just echo James's comments for the accommodation industry as well. Not really a specific question there, but we're seeing the companies that were in a good position before COVID are being able to take this opportunity to do that type of refurbishment. And, you know, those that have a diversified balance sheet or, you know, like I said before, we're in a good position, are able to borrow during this time. So I think it is really interesting to see how different companies are being able to use this opportunity, just the same way that governments are using this opportunity to push that reset button, as Halatoa said, and look at and think about how we can build back better destinations. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessie. Right, well, I think that's all the questions that we've, and certainly we've run out of time, that's for sure. So Chris, back to you to close.
Thank you, Matthew, and thanks again to SPTO, Jam Share, we see him there up on the screen, for hosting today, to Chris Cocker and the whole team at SPTO, and thanks for all the work you're doing. Thank you very much to Jessie, to James, to Halatoa, and to you, Matthew, for your time and input today. We look forward to connecting with everybody, not just virtually. Hopefully we can connect in person soon. So have a great rest of your day wherever you are across the Pacific or around the world, and talk soon.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone on behalf of SPTO, especially Matt and Chris for reaching out to SPTO and getting this all organized. Thank you, Jessie, James, and Halatoa for joining and for this wonderful webinar. We just from SPTO's perspective, we've been having webinars every 2 weeks. The next webinar will be in the next fortnight. We will have someone from Tahiti Tourism joining us, sharing their experience for opening the border. So we will be sending out the invite next week once everything is finalized, and hope to see you guys joining in for that webinar as well. That's it for me, and hope you have the rest of the enjoyable week ahead. Thank you, guys. All right. See you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.